I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. We are in number something of our Lu Xun series. And today we have another very special guest.
They're all special, but some are more special than others. This is Dean James Carter of St. Joseph's University. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Carter.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's always nice to have a chance to talk with colleagues and friends.
Professor Carter, in 2020, Norton published your book, Champions Day, The End of Old Shanghai. Is that correct?
That is correct.
It's a great book. Check it out if you get the chance. You are doing research on early 20th century China. And this story that we're looking at today, medicine, is one of Lu Xun's. I think it tends to get ignored some, but when we were talking about what story we should do, you mentioned you wanted to do this, and I actually really like this story. It's, I think, ignored some to the detriment of scholars. You like to teach it, right?
Yeah, in terms of Lu Xun, I'm primarily in my day job as a history professor. So it's a teaching heavy institution. And so most of what I'm doing is teaching undergraduates. I don't have any graduate students. Very rarely do I have anybody with Chinese language experience or abilities. And so teaching Lu Xun I think teaching Lu Xun is good precisely because, for some of the reasons that I think make this story maybe less popular with scholars than some of his others. It doesn't have the kind of ambitions, of something like Diary of a Madman or AQ, which I also enjoy teaching. But the nice thing about medicine for teaching undergraduates is that the symbolism is so like between your eyes with a 2x4 that for undergraduates who are coming to it and they really don't know a lot of the context, when you say this symbolism is, we have blood and we have like their names and these, what they're eating literally, and they're talking about all that thing is really so explicit that it makes it really effective to teach as a historian. And let's be clear, I'm not a literature scholar. I'm teaching this as an historian. So that can get us into all sorts of trouble someplace, but that's where we are.
Professor Carter, I was wondering, you mentioned the symbolism is kind of hitting you in the eye and it's very clear. Tell me about that symbolism, if you don't mind.
It's funny. So I'm usually almost always teaching it in translation, right? So one of the noteworthy things about this is, especially in the Gladys Yang translation that's kind of standard. I mean, now there's a Julia Lovell translation as well. But the translation actually leaves out some of the most important symbolism, which is literally in the text. And so that kind of gives me a chance to sort of also introduce to students why it is that reading something in the original makes a difference, even though I'm teaching in translation. So, I mean, as the story begins, right, you've got this, you don't understand exactly what's going on, but there's a father who has a sick child and he goes out for some kind of mysterious reasons, makes this kind of illicit transaction. And it becomes clear eventually that what he's done is he's gone out and he's gotten a mantou, he's gotten a bun, that's soaked in human blood. And that blood, as it turns out, is from an executed revolutionary who he then brings back to his son because it's supposed to be a cure for his illness, which we learn is tuberculosis or consumption. And then he's going to give him that bun soaked in blood, and that's the way he's going to get healed. So just to begin there, like that level of symbolism, Lu Xun obviously is into the whole idea of cannibalism and Chinese civilization and culture cannibalizing itself. Now you've literally got, again, I just love the way that this is set up. It's not simply that you're devouring the blood of your countrymen, but it's that you're taking the blood of one young man, of one revolutionary whose blood has been spilled by the government, and it's being fed to another young man in an effort to cure him. But I think implicit, and Lu Xun has his own sort of medical role in medicine, and having studied medicine, I think he's also of the notion that this is also a folk remedy that's not going to help. So, I mean, spoiler alert, it doesn't work. I mean, the kid dies. And so now you've wound up with both children being dead. And this attempt to save him actually is simply an illustration of Chinese society and cannibalizing itself. So that kind of symbolism just to begin with, and it's all packed into in English translation, runs to 8 pages, into a really dense story.
You mentioned the name. The last name of this family is Hua. So you've got Hua Lao Xuan, and that's the father, Old Xuan Hua, and the mom is just literally Hua Dama.
Yeah.
And what's the symbolism behind that?
Well, so you've got a double symbolism in the English translation, and I was double checking this last night because I was comparing the Chinese version with the English version. The English version never mentions the family name. And so, of course, Hua is essential because Hua, means China. Like this is the Chinese family. So they're representing China, this Hua in the name, but it's not in the English translation. You don't get their family name in the English translation, which is so frustrating. And I meant to check Julia Lovell's translation. I can't remember if she does it there.
Lovell mentions it, but she's not quite as clear. She says something about Hua and Xia being like signifying Chineseness, but it's a little ambiguous. Right.
And so then I think at the end, so then the other family, the family of the revolutionary, is the Xia family. So both of these, this Hua Xia is this representation of China. And so, I think, again, I'm a little thinking of it very cinematically. When you get to the end of the story, you then have the mothers of the two dead children, the two dead sons, and they're next to each other. And so you've got kind of Hua Xia, this representing China, both buried in the ground, with the older generation mourning them for having failed to protect them or promote them or to look after the country. And the future of the country is literally buried in the ground. So when you talk about that symbolism, you can still make that symbolism without the names. But again, I think part of what makes Lu Xun so accessible is that the imagery is so blunt. And I think that's a loss. But it's kind of a bonus when you're dealing with students, most of whom don't have the language. Then it's kind of a cool reveal when you can, tell what their names mean, because it's, we don't tend to do it. It's a little too on the nose for most literary scholars, I think.
It's interesting too, because one of the things that I find fascinating about Lu Xun is he has dimensions where really you're only going to be able to appreciate it if you've studied Chinese or have some awareness of the history and background. So this is an example, the names, the historical background of the story, etc. But then you have other moments that are clearly not that. And so one of the things that attracts me to this story is the very last episode with the mothers. When we talked with Professor Brian Van Norden about the story Kong Yi Ji, one of the things he said was there are no heroes in Lu Xun. You have people you sort of feel sorry for, but no heroes. But when I read about these two mothers, the Shua, the son who died eating the blood-soaked mantou, his mother does something at the end of this story, and I'm curious if you see it as heroic or not. It's a very small act of heroism, but she's there to mourn her son, and she sees this other mother and effectively goes and supports her and walks out of her own grief to help this woman out of the graveyard and back to their lives together. So when I read that feels heroic, even on a small scale. Would you read it that way as well, or does this just seem kind of melancholy and almost pathetic?
No, I agree with you completely. That's where I was going to go with it too. It does feel heroic to me. And as a lot of times, and I remember reading this in AQ, in the story of AQ, one of, his longest short story, or his novella, however you want to look at it. But in the true story of AQ, there is this disembodied voice that comes up at the end, which it sounds like one person is saying it, but if you look at the text, actually, it's not at all clear who, if anyone, is saying it. And there's some of this in here. There's a lot of dialogue that's implied. My reading of that story is that, so the other mother is the mother of the dead revolutionary who's been buried there. And I was looking through the story, and I'm not sure if I can actually confirm that, but that's my impression. So I think that but I don't think they know who one another is. So I don't think that the first mother, the mother of the child who died of tuberculosis, I don't think she's aware that the other mother there, her son had died, and it was his blood that they'd fed to her son in an effort to get him to survive. But it doesn't matter in terms of her act of heroism. And I do think it's an act of heroism, and it's a very, you can get in, if you want to take it in terms of like party politics. You can say that it really is like supporting the people. It's this effort to support the people and to stand together against whatever it is that the government or the society is doing. It's the people who need to come together. But it's an act of kindness. It's an act of kindness in a world that, as you're saying, the notion that Lu Xun, there are no heroes. The world is, Lu Xun's world ain't fair. That's for certain. Kong Yi Ji is another of my favorite stories. Full disclosure, part of the reason why I teach medicine and Kong Yi Ji probably I teach those the most is because they're short. So when you're teaching in an undergraduate class, you can go in and you can summarize them and you can get them at them very effectively. But I agree. I think this last act is a gesture towards something that represents a kind of a kindness that Lu Xun is lamenting, that it's been kind of beaten out of China in this revolutionary period when I think he would say himself there are no heroes. I don't think that's just an analysis. I think Lu Xun would probably agree with that.
So you mentioned earlier that medicine is kind of dealing with some of these other issues that Lu Xun is fascinated by, the blood, the cannibalism. How does medicine line up with these other more famous stories that we've been talking about, like Kong Yiji, like Diary of a Madman, AQ? Where does this story fit in? Is it just a simplistic version of Diary of a Madman, or do you see it as going in a different direction, or how should we process this story?
I think that it's more real, and in some ways it's less, so it's less imaginary. I mean, Diary of a Madman is a work of creative genius. I mean, because you really are, by the end of it, you're questioning. I mean, it's really difficult to know, like who's sane. What does it mean to be sane? Like, is he telling the truth? And I think reasonable people can disagree about the main character and their sanity and who's the real villain, all those things, all those layers. And that's why that story is so complicated. Medicine is not complicated at all. And so whereas the implication in Diary of a Madman is that Chinese culture has been symbolically and maybe literally, but cannibalizing itself for, millennia, like forever. It's been doing this. In medicine, the implication, he's not making a grand implication in the story itself. It's simply that they've got this folk remedy. This folk remedy is dumb. Like, it's a waste of time. Like, it's not actually going to help anybody. But what it involves is the blood of human beings. And so he's saying I don't think he's implying that Chinese society is about devouring itself, but he is pointing out this act, the symbolic act, which results in the consumption of another human being. And I write Diary of a Madman, I probably enjoy more. And I've taught that one too. Whenever my class falls and on Halloween, I try to teach Diary of a Madman. But with medicine, it's so blunt. And so the idea is, if Diary of a Madman, some of my more literal minded students are like, well, this doesn't make it, like, he's clearly just hallucinating. And so he's imagining he's seeing these things, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's fine, but that's not real. This one is, okay, it's real. And so I think the criticism that Lu Xun is making, he's criticizing both the traditional values, which encourage people to rely not on science, but to rely on these sort of folk tales and, old wives' tales, for lack of a better term. But he's also using this to point out the hypocrisy of the system. Or not even hypocrisy. They say it's a feature, not a bug. Like, the idea is that they are trying to eliminate the younger generation. They're trying to keep people from changing and moving forward. Yeah. So that's where I think that story comes in. Kong Yiji is really effective, looking at a different aspect of the same phenomenon, right? You've got an older generation that has become completely useless, but in Kong Yiji's case, it comes to grief. And in medicine's case, it's the younger generation that comes to grief. I think his point in saying that there are no heroes is it's not like the older generation is succeeding by holding the younger generation down. He's not saying the younger generation is succeeding by fighting against the power, saying that the whole system implicitly needs to be blown up.
Well, and I'm curious because on scholarship on Lu Xun's fiction, there's a tendency to believe that he rails against the old Confucian order, tradition, the old stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, pretty frequently in his stories, we get characters who follow the old traditions and are presented very either ambiguously or sympathetically. Like this couple, the father and the mother here, both they're a very good father and mother. The father braves what looks like some very violent streets. Lu Xun describes a crowd. There's a lot of political unrest. The father still goes out before dawn where it's not safe to try to get this remedy to save his kid. Now, as readers in the modern era, we know it's doomed to failure. Do you think we are meant to see these characters following the old order as somewhat pathetic, or do you think Lu Xun is presenting them as something more noble, but also sort of tragically doomed?
I would go with tragically doomed more than pathetic. I don't think he presents them as completely admirable, because there is so it's like many of Lu Xun's stories, right? It's divided up into these very easy to define parts. It's like the scene 3, which is the one where the child's eaten the medicine and they're hoping that he's going to come get better. I mean, one of the brilliant parts of how this, from a fiction craft kind of point of view, is you don't see the son die. It's like he's getting the medicine and then he's taking the medicine and then they're at the cemetery. So it's left to your imagination how all that happened. But the parents, they're celebrating, or everybody who's there is celebrating the death of the execution of this revolutionary. That's and the good fortune. It's like doubly good fortune. On the one hand, we got rid of this rascal, and the translation, the Gladys Yang translation, they get rid of this rascal who was a troublemaker and up to no good. But also how lucky that we found out and this happened, and so we were able to get not just human blood, but it's hot, it's fresh, it's right there, so they can get it. Like this is supposed to make it even more effective.
So my last question deals with, we've been talking about common elements in between these stories. You've got blood, you've got cannibalism. Another one is the crowd. And we haven't talked about that one yet. And for me, it's one of the stranger parts of the story because on the surface, it doesn't really seem to fit. So the father's going out in the early morning, I think even before daylight. I think it dawns as he's out there to get this quack medicine. And as he's going, he's sort of hiding behind a wall or something because people have noticed him. And then as he looks, the people increase, and now you've got a crowd, and they're going up to watch something involving soldiers, and then they all flood back towards him. That's the only information we get. So the other place something like this happens is at the very end of the true story of AQ, when there's a crowd, and they just sort of dissolve into a faceless mob. What's to be gained in this story by giving us a faceless mob? Why is that there?
Yeah, I wondered about that too, and that was exactly the parallel. And as I mentioned before, that same kind of disembodied voicing that's in that the execution of AQ is it all devolves into this faceless crowd. Like they think of them as like wolves that are going to devour him. I think it's really ambiguous because on the one hand, you want. Lu Xun represents the people and kind of almost a populist approach that like these are the problems that China's facing, the problems that China's people are facing because its leaders have let it down so badly. And so we need to find a way to empower the people and to not just to politically empower them, but to culturally and socially give them a place at the table. But then he sees the other, like this crowd, like going out into the population. It's not a safe place. The people are dangerous, and they're not really even personified, and it's really threatening. So I don't really know what exactly to make of that, except for the notion that the world is a dangerous place, and that's I think the world that Lu Xun's character inhabits is a very dangerous world, and it's again I guess how I would interpret it. It kind of goes back to the cannibalism metaphor. So it's not as explicit as it was with the blood, or as kind of developed as it was in Diary of a Madman, but just that society is kind of threatening its own. Like you can't count on the other people around you to support you and protect you because they're gonna threaten you and undermine you.
Which ties in, I think, to when we were talking about Kong Yiji, we noticed that Lu Xun sort of spreads the criticism around. It's not just the rich, the elites, the government that get it. It's everybody. There's people at the bottom rungs of society who are every bit as despicable as the top rungs. And so at some point, they kind of become a crowd, except when Lu Xun decides to pull one or two of them out, like the parents of this kid, and set them a different role.
No, I think that's right. A crowd is comprised of individuals, but a crowd is different than a collection of individuals. I think that's right.
Right. There's I used to hear it expressed in Chinese as the difference between 所有的人 or 每一个人. Like each person, all people together,
As we're kind of wrapping up, there was something that I realized when I was going back and looking over the story that I wanted to point out. So we've been kind of comparing and contrasting medicine with Lu Xun's other stories, and I definitely agree with you, Professor Carter, that this is not as good of a story in terms of its fancy smancy literary value, if we can say that, but it's a much better story to teach. But I see so many elements of his other stories kind of I'm going to use the word being cannibalized in this story, or being cannibalized from this story to other stories. And one thing, there's a famous line in Lu Xun, the path is made by people walking on it.
Yeah, when many people pass away, a road is made, yeah.
In the beginning of section 4, we have actually a kind of thing where he does that. I'm just going to read the line. 中间哇哇斜斜一条细路是拼作编道的人用鞋地造成的. This quote that's from a much more famous piece. I think it's from...
It's from My Old Home.
It's from My Old Home, yeah. So Gushang. And Gushang is written much later, so I wonder, is Lu Xun kind of taking elements of this story and kind of repackaging them in Gushang? Because that line is essentially, I'm sorry, I should have kind of translated it from Chinese, but it's essentially saying the same thing. You know, this road, this small pathway is formed by people just walking on it. And I wonder how much of all of Lu Xun's fiction is just a cannibalistic venture, that he is even trying to kind of cannibalize himself. I don't know if we can make anything of that, but I just, in our discussion of Lu Xun, it's interesting how much we're trying to figure out what is coming from other elements of Lu Xun in this story.
No, I think that's right. In fact, when I had, yesterday when I was thinking about this and I was going back to read, I was thinking that, and I definitely want to talk about that passage about how when many people pass along a road is made, and then I looked and said, wait, that's not from this story at all. It's from a different story, but it is there. It's put together. No, I think you're right. I mean, he obviously recycles a number of themes. I mean, there are themes he thinks are important, and so he finds different ways to get at them. Yeah, I think that's really insightful, and I think it's useful, and that's why his stories, when you read them, I mean, they complement each other, they build onto one another, and I think that's the weakness of Lu Xun as an author, is that you don't see a lot of development. I mean, it's not that all the stories are the same; they're all different, and some are better than others. But he certainly has themes that he's interested in getting across. What I was going to say is that as a way of ending, the ending of the story is the other. I think it's really, really poignant, the end of the story, because they're, as I'm reading it and they talk about, she says, like, there's the crow who's there, and it says, if this crow would come, there's a crow sitting on a tree, and the mother says, like, if I'll know that my son is, at rest and in heaven, if the crow will just fly down and land on his gravestone. And they wait, and the crow doesn't. And then they leave together. And again, this act of kindness that you're talking about, like the two women leave together. And then as they leave, they hear the crow caw, and like, is this going to be the Hollywood version? It's like, then they're going to see the crow go down and land. No, the crow takes off and flies away. It doesn't give her the comfort that she's looking for. And I think that's the statement. It says, like, it flies off toward the horizon. And I think that really is kind of that notion of the world's not fair. There are no heroes. It's like, it's not looking so good.
It's such a Lu Xun ending.
Well, it's such a Lu Xun ending, but the reference I wanted to throw in there actually also at this ending is Camus, Albert Camus. In the novel, The Plague, La Peste, what makes someone noble in that world is just having the strength to just keep going, to just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, the doctor in the novel continues being a doctor, even though he believes most of them are doomed. He still keeps doing his job. And here, these two mothers have been hoping for what amounts to a miracle. They get the reverse. And the next motion is the mother of the kid who died of tuberculosis taking the other woman's arm and going, basically, let's get home. Come on, let's get back. Like, helping her out of the cemetery. And it's this strength to say, all is lost. We've made the worst mistake ever, but we just got to keep going. That's the kind of thing that counts as heroism in Lu Xun.
So is that what makes us human? And that's for both of y'all. Is that for Lu Xun? Is that what makes us human in Lu Xun's fiction? Is not fake Hollywood heroism of, things ending with a happy ending, but the sort of like small acts of kindness that we can show. I'm thinking of 一件小事, a small little incident. It's another story in this collection of Nahan. Nothing happens. Like no one is saved here. Is that how we act as humans? Is that how we are, like, do our best to be human in a inhumane world?
I think that is, and I think that's a really, Lu Xun, because he died relatively young, right? It would have been interesting to see how his character developed, because I think his politics are not actually that ultimately compatible with the party. Like he's very much adopted by the Communist Party as a forerunner of challenging traditional China, arguing for this kind of new way forward, and he's pro-revolutionary. Although if you read his works, his take on the revolution is mixed at best. So I don't think in the long term he would have been supportive of this project, because I think talk about historical nihilism. I think he's really very much an existentialist. I mean, he really is saying that there isn't any meaning out there apart from what we bring to it, what we create our meaning out of it. I mean, that the crow isn't landing on the grave. No one's coming to the rescue. It's really just about the people caring for one another. And honestly, that's not going to work out well most of the time either, but that's still what we need to do.
Just to remind ourselves of the chronology of Lu Xun's career, this is also the kind of kindness that has been extended to him, because he had given up writing, given up literature. When a friend convinced him, at least this is how he presents it in the introduction to Nahan, to continue writing, his response isn't, you know what, you've got a point. Let's go out and save the world. He just kind of goes, yeah, all right, whatever. Like it's this, fine, I'll just keep going. I don't care. I guess I'll just keep trying. And I think that's important, because amazing things happen because he just kind of went, okay, fine, whatever. And so there's at least an implication that you never really do know what might happen if you just take someone's arm and just extend kindness to them.
Yeah.
I think this is a good place to wrap it up, Professor Carter, especially since you've just branded Lu Xun a historical nihilist.
That's right. This might be the end of my China connection. So
yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if any of us are going to get visas to the PRC anytime soon after that. It's funny, like we kept trying to end this podcast, but it kept getting more and more interesting. I think this story has so much to offer once you really dig into it and think about the implications of the story for the rest of Lu Xun's work. You're right, Professor Carter. This is hitting you over the head with that symbolism, but man, I just can't stop liking Lu Xun.
And it's part of the reason why I like the story partly because it's short. That's not just simply to say that you can get through it quickly. It's also that, in a novel, and novels are really hard to write, but you get a lot of chances to say something. You can develop a point of view over time, and you can give it to different characters, and you can have those characters develop. So it can be really, really complicated. Lu Xun's, they're short, they're spare. There's a lot packed into each of these stories. And in fact, what we said, it's the narration that's not assigned to a particular character, the things that we don't see on the page. In some ways, this is about the death of a child, but the child doesn't die in the story. Like the child is sick and then the child is dead. But you don't see those critical events happen. And so that's, it really is. I think it's rich. So I'm glad it held up, because when I picked it, I hadn't read it in a couple of years. I was like, oh, maybe it's not going to hold up, but I think it did.
All right. I think that's a great place to end it. So before we go, just a reminder, this is Dean James Carter of St. Joseph's University. He's the author of Champions Days, The End of Old Shanghai. Go out, read it, buy it on Amazon or wherever you get your books from. We have been discussing Lu Xun's Medicine from Nahan. This is part of our Lu Xun series. We're going to continue with it for a while longer, right, Rob?
Yes, indeed. Before we sign off, once again, Chin Lit Pod, if you're going to Twitter. Chinese Lit Pod, that's us at Instagram. And Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com. They're all pretty easy to remember. And of course, Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. Thank you, Professor Carter, for joining us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.